Nintendo seems to have a bit of a history with lost games. And finally, another one of those legendary titles sees an official release. Star Fox 2 opens up with a great cinematic of a space dragon vaporizing a ship in half before munching on another ship and then going after the player. Right away, it looks a lot more exciting than the original, which had already set a high bar. It's important to understand that Star Fox 2 is very different from its predecessor, a point which surprised me right when I started. Players may choose from any member of Team Star Fox, including new members Miyu and Faye, each of which have their own unique statistics. Peppy and Slippy are slow but have high defensive values, while Miyu and Faye are glass cannons, fast and powerful but prone to an easy death. Fox and Falco round out the team with average stats. The player chooses both a main pilot and a wingman who provides the player with advice and acts as an extra life should the main pilot fall in battle. While the first Star Fox was mostly a linear game, the sequel adopts a sort of strategic simulation approach, kind of like how Star Fox Command would many years later. The player moves a cursor across the map and directs the pilot on where to go. Running into an enemy ship, a traveling missile, or landing on an occupied planet will begin the game proper. Regular space battles are merely shoot to kill, while larger targets may have multiple objectives to accomplish. The original Star Fox was basically a rail shooter of sorts, similar to Afterburner. However, Star Fox 2 allows for vastly greater freedom of movement. For those who have played Star Fox 64 and recall the all-range mode, well, every level in Star Fox 2 is all-range mode. A radar is provided to help navigate the environment with power-ups and enemies clearly marked. The goal isn't just to stop Andross's forces this time around. The player also has to prevent enemy units from reaching the planet Corneria, which will steadily receive damage until hitting 100%, after which the game immediately ends. Each stage tracks the amount of time spent, and enemy units progress and attack Corneria in real time. I'm impressed by this, as the game seems to have a sort of internal clock as well as a memory of what enemy units are supposed to be doing and when. In other words, actions can take place outside of a level, and this is relayed to the player in the middle of a mission. It's even possible to take on one target only to be interrupted by another nearby enemy, and now the player has to deal with multiple targets. Some enemies can even escape from the player, further wasting time and raising the stakes. I can't say enough how impressive this is. The gameplay isn't just non-linear and presented in a random fashion, it's also dynamic. Objectives can change on the fly depending on the current situation and how much closer the enemy forces are getting towards Corneria. This is something that isn't seen very often, even today, and it's pulled off extremely well here. If the player could perhaps control their main pilot as well as a wingman separately, then this could have been a lot more interesting, and it would have also helped with the longevity if different maps were available. However, as it stands, and for a Super Nintendo game that was originally developed in the mid-90s, this is shockingly well done. As for the gameplay itself, that's more of a hit or miss. Liberating planets involves searching for switches or taking down a boss, which will then open the planet's base. Within the base, players navigate a maze with more hidden switches and enemies before taking on the boss and finally moving on. Giant space carriers act in a very similar manner, and space battles are pretty self-explanatory, with some of the more dangerous threats, like the aforementioned space dragon, requiring much more effort to deal with. At any time during a mission, the R-Wing can be transformed into a walker and back again to help with either navigation or speed as the player discerns. Upon wiping out Andross's army across the Lilat system, His home base is infiltrated, which is, once again, yet another maze to explore, before taking on Andross himself. Levels get repetitive fast, and there are only minor alterations between missions. Fortuna has underwater sections, Macbeth is compromised of floating islands above lava, and Meteor has this stupid randomization switch that I absolutely hate. But for the most part, every stage is really similar. This didn't bother me too much, but I can bet that most players will get sick of it rather quickly. I enjoyed the game enough to take the time to complete it on each of the 3 difficulties, however I'm sure mileage will vary for most players. You can't really mention Star Fox on the Super Nintendo without going over the hilariously bad frame rate. And it's actually a stranger anomaly in the sequel than it is in the first game. While the original Star Fox had a pretty awful frame rate, it still controlled very well. It had a mess of other problems, but at the least, piloting the R-Wing wasn't one of them. Star Fox 2, however, is very different. The frame rate is both better and worse depending on the situation. Space battles are very smooth, while indoor bases run like a slideshow. During moments of low frame rate, controlling the ship becomes increasingly more difficult, and strangely, a significant input delay is noticeable. It's odd because the first Star Fox is still perfectly controllable, while the sequel suffers significantly under low frame rates. I'm not sure if this is due to how the Super Nintendo Classic is rendering and outputting its games, but I haven't noticed this issue in any of the other titles, only with Star Fox 2. It's still perfectly playable, but it is less than ideal. The major problem with Star Fox 2 is the lack of balance. Powering up the player's blasters is a staple of the series, and it's represented here as well. However, the amount of increase in power is completely absurd. Without any power-ups, the player is practically defenseless and has no hopes in stopping Andross's overwhelming army, mainly because the low power means that larger battles take forever to complete as enemy forces press on to Corneria. Yet, with full power-up, the opposite becomes the case. Bosses die in mere seconds, and targets are destroyed faster than they can move. It becomes a complete slaughter. Special weapons can also be collected, which include the classic smart bombs, hearts which fully heal the player upon use, and a shield which makes the player invulnerable for a limited time. Variety is nice, but only one special weapon can be carried at a time, and the hearts are a no-brainer, especially when combined with Peppy and Slippy's extreme level of defense. This allows the player to simply throw themselves at enemies with reckless abandon, as well as tackling multiple missions at a time without the need to return to the mothership for repairs. Unfortunately, obtaining power-ups seems to be pretty random. Enemies often drop small health capsules, but upgrading the R-Wing's blasters and collecting hearts isn't quite as easy. They are often hidden on planet surfaces, but not always. I managed to make it to the end of the game without a single upgrade, and it is nigh impossible to finish this way. On the other hand, achieving the highest score rank on the highest difficulty is effortless with full power-up. Thus, player skill actually gives way to collecting upgrades. And it's actually beneficial to spend extra time exploring each corner of a planet's surface because, in the long run, a single blaster upgrade will mean the difference between victory and defeat. If the game was balanced more appropriately, perhaps by reducing the power of upgraded blasters or by making the other special weapons more useful, then I could see Star Fox 2 having a good amount of replay value due to the different pilots, randomized missions, and non-linear structure. As it stands, however, it's not something I can see myself coming back to after how harshly I managed to steamroll it. Don't get me wrong though, the initial journey in mastering the controls, discovering the various secrets, and confronting the game's many surprises was most definitely worth it. It's not $80 worth it, but this is a great game nonetheless, and it deeply saddens me that this never saw an original release, as it would have no doubt blown away anyone who played it back then, low frame rate notwithstanding. For any Star Fox fan, this is a no-brainer, and I highly encourage it for retro enthusiasts as well. Modern day gamers might not get what all the fuss is about and will no doubt be turned off by its initially awkward controls and unforgiving difficulty curve. But those who stick with it will not only find an enjoyable adventure, but also unique and noteworthy features. It's not the best in the series, but it is a solid entry that is well worth playing.
What's a mission? Adios, Android. Let's head back to Corneria.
Thank you for watching my review of Star Fox 2. If you enjoyed my video, click the like button, and if you'd like to see more, subscribe.